My name is Marcus Jefferson, and I'm 29 years old. I work as a food delivery driver in Denver, Colorado. It was a cold, late night when I got the order. I remember the time well. It was 11:45 p.m. The request was for an apartment complex on the edge of town. The address was for apartment 4B, and the name on the order was Amanda. When I arrived at the building, it felt off. The usual buzz of late-night activity was missing. The complex was eerily silent, and the lights in the hallway flickered intermittently. I double-checked the order to make sure I had the right place and headed up the stairs. The door to apartment 4B was slightly ajar. I knocked a few times and called out, "Amanda, it's your food delivery." There was no response. I hesitated, feeling a chill run down my spine. Every instinct told me to leave, but I was already here, and I needed the money. I pushed the door open slowly and peered inside. The apartment was dark, save for the glow of a television in the living room. It was playing a news channel, but the sound was turned off. I stepped in, calling out again. "Amanda, I've got your delivery." The apartment was clean and neat, but there was something unsettling about it. The air felt heavy, and the silence was almost deafening. As I walked further in, I glanced at the TV screen. What I saw made my heart race. It wasn't showing a regular program. It was a live feed of the apartment hallway. There I was, standing in front of the door, clearly visible on the screen. My face went pale, and I felt a surge of panic. I turned and ran for the door, but something felt wrong. The hallway seemed darker than before, and the flickering lights made it hard to see clearly. When I reached the building's exit, I saw flashing police lights and a few officers talking to each other. I approached them, my voice shaking. "I think something's wrong. I just went to deliver food to 4B, and there was a live feed of me on the TV. The door was open, and no one was there." The officers exchanged worried glances, and one of them said, "Stay here. We need to speak with you." They led me to the side and explained that Amanda had been dead for 3 days. Her body was discovered earlier that day. They had no idea who placed the order, but it was clear that whoever did was still at large and had been waiting for someone to come to that apartment. The feeling of dread was overwhelming. I thought about the live feed of the hallway and the way it had made me feel so exposed. The police were investigating the apartment, but all I could think about was how close I had come to walking into a trap. As they continued their work, I couldn't shake the image of that TV screen from my mind. Whoever had ordered that food knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted someone to find Amanda's empty apartment, and they used me as a pawn in their sick game. I went back to my car, my hands still trembling. I don't think I'll ever forget that night, the silent apartment, the live feed of my own self, and the chilling realization that I had been part of something far more sinister than a simple delivery. That order was a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones you see coming, but the ones you realize just in time. My name is Sarah Collins, and I'm 24 years old. I work as a food delivery driver in a bustling suburb of Denver, Colorado. It was a busy Friday night, and I had just finished a long shift when I got a delivery request to an upscale house on the edge of town. The house was enormous, with expensive cars parked in the driveway. When I pulled up, I noticed a tall, pale man with an unsettling grin waiting at the door. He didn't say a word as he opened it, but his smile never wavered. He handed me a generous tip, much more than usual, and then closed the door. I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was something off about him, but I quickly shook it off and headed back to my car. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw him standing in the driveway, still grinning and watching me as I left. It was an eerie sight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to focus on the road and put it out of my mind. Later that night, I got another order from the same address. It seemed odd, but I figured it was just a late-night snack request. When I arrived at the house again, It was dark. All the lights were off, and there was no sign of life. I knocked on the door and called out, but there was no response. My unease grew as I noticed that the large, decorative windows by the door were slightly open. I crouched down and peeked through one of them. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the dim light coming from outside, was a body slumped in a chair. The figure was covered in blood, and the room was in disarray. The man with the unsettling grin was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in, and I didn't know what to do. My mind raced as I thought of the possible danger. I immediately called the police and told them what I had seen, urging them to come quickly. While waiting for them to arrive, I paced back and forth, feeling sick to my stomach. The house seemed even more menacing in the dark, and every little sound made me jump. When the police finally showed up, they were serious and efficient. They quickly assessed the situation and confirmed that the body was indeed that of the homeowner. Later, they informed me that the homeowner had been killed hours before my first delivery. The man who had answered the door and given me the tip was an imposter. They believed he was someone who had come to rob the place and possibly harm anyone who got too close. I was shaken to my core. The realization that I had been involved in something so horrific made my stomach churn. If I hadn't noticed the darkened house and the body inside, things might have ended very differently. The thought of that man watching me as I left, his grin fixed in place, still sends chills down my spine. That night changed me. I've always been cautious, but now I'm constantly on edge whenever I make deliveries. The unsettling grin of the man and the bloodied body are burned into my memory, a stark reminder of how quickly things can turn dark and dangerous. My name is Logan Rivera, and I'm 26 years old. I work as a food delivery driver in Denver, Colorado. I remember that night vividly. It was chilly, and the streets were eerily quiet. I had just one delivery left to finish my shift. The order came from an address in a rundown part of town I hadn't visited before. The area had seen better days. Most of the houses were either abandoned or falling apart. When I pulled up to the address, I was greeted by an unsettling sight. The house was in complete disrepair. The windows were boarded up with old, splintered wood, and the yard was overgrown with weeds and litter. It looked like no one had lived there for years. I felt a chill as I approached, but I was determined to get the job done and head home. I called the customer to confirm the delivery details. They instructed me to leave the food on the porch and leave quickly. As I set the food down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house seemed abandoned, but then I heard a faint sound, sobbing. It was barely audible, but it was definitely there. My heart skipped a beat. I hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door, calling out. "Hello? Is someone there?" I hear crying. There was no response. The sobbing continued for a few seconds, then abruptly stopped. I waited, feeling uneasy. I knocked again and tried calling out, but the silence that followed was heavy and unnerving. Deciding it was best not to stick around, I started heading back to my car. As I reached the driver's side, I glanced back at the house one more time. That's when I saw her, a young girl standing at one of the boarded-up windows. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She mouthed the words, "Help me." My blood turned to ice. I rushed back to the porch, but the girl was gone. The house remained as silent as ever. Panic set in, and I immediately called the police. I explained everything, the sobbing, the girl's face at the window, and my growing sense of dread. The dispatcher assured me they would send officers to investigate. While waiting, I stood at the edge of the property, trying to keep an eye on the house. The minutes felt like hours. Finally, the police arrived, and I met them at the porch. I led them to the door and explained what I had seen. They conducted a thorough search of the house, checking every room and nook. When they finished, they came back to me with grim expressions. They found no sign of anyone in the house, no girl, no evidence of recent activity. The place was as empty as when I had first arrived. The police were kind but puzzled. They assured me they would continue to investigate, but for now, there was no trace of the girl or any clues to explain what I had seen. As the officers left, I spoke with a few of the neighbors who had gathered out of curiosity. One older man, his face lined with concern, shared a chilling detail. He told me that years ago, a family had been brutally murdered in that very house. Since then, no one had lived there. The house had become a ghostly reminder of the tragedy that had occurred. The revelation hit me hard. I couldn't get the image of that girl's terrified face out of my mind. What had I really seen? Was it possible that the house, with its dark past, was somehow connected to what I had witnessed? The idea of a spirit or a haunting was hard to digest, but it seemed like the only explanation. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of them. The sobbing, the girl's face, the abandoned house. It all felt like a nightmare I couldn't escape. The thought of someone, or something, in that house crying out for help while I stood outside, helpless, was almost too much to bear. The next day, I drove back to the house, hoping to find some answers or at least some closure. The house was still boarded up, and there was no sign of activity. I felt a chill as I looked up at the dark windows, wondering if the girl's face would appear again. To this day, I avoid that part of town whenever I can. The memory of that night lingers, a stark reminder of how quickly things can turn unsettling and eerie. The girl's desperate plea for help, her terrified eyes, and the ghostly silence of that abandoned house are burned into my memory. Sometimes, as I drive by, I can't help but glance at that house, hoping to never see her face again.